Hi, everyone. Welcome to this trauma-informed care training. Thanks for logging on to complete this training today. My name is Clara. I'll be leading the first half of this session. And today we're going to be talking about trauma-informed practices for working with students. This is also your last step to becoming a reading partner. So thank you so much for completing all of the necessary trainings. We're super thankful and we hope you get some great information out of this session. All right, so with that, we can go ahead and jump in. So these are our desired objectives, what we hope you'll walk away from this training with. We want to note that becoming trauma-informed is a process. It's not something you'll be an expert in at the end of this hour-long session. So the goal of this presentation is really to increase our shared knowledge and understanding about trauma, how it can impact our students, and how we might begin to respond differently to meet our students' needs. So you can see our objectives listed here. We'll work on building consensus and those shared definitions and understanding of trauma and the key principles and prevalence of trauma. We hope you walk away with some knowledge about how trauma can impact the brain and behavior. We'll learn about the Search Institute's developmental relationships framework and do a little reflecting on some practices we currently do and can start doing to build strong relationships and regulation skills with young people. And with that, we can go ahead and jump in. So like I said, or like I mentioned on the previous slide, becoming a trauma-informed educator, learning trauma-informed care, it's not something we'll be experts in at the end of this 1 hour session. It's really an ongoing process to better support people who have experienced trauma. We're all, including myself, on this learning journey, and we hope that this will be a great jumping off point for many of our volunteers. So what does it mean to be a trauma-informed educator? There isn't a single way to be trauma-informed, but there are some shared characteristics of trauma-informed practices. You can see them listed on the slide. We're going to walk through them now. So the first one is realizes. Trauma-informed organizations realize and make known the prevalence and impact of trauma. So today we're going to work on building that shared understanding in the language about trauma and resilience that reflects the common needs of students exposed to trauma. Basically, we need to know what can happen while acknowledging that it does not always happen. So trauma-informed educators don't assume their students are dealing with the impact of trauma, but we understand that it's possible. The second one is recognizes. So trauma-informed organizations incorporate ways to recognize the signs of trauma and the need for learning or behavioral supports. So today we're going to talk about some of the neurobiological impacts of trauma, and it will become clear that some students need learning supports. Again, not every child experiences trauma, and even if they have, not everyone is impacted in the same way. But the types of learning and behavioral supports that we'll talk about today are good for all students. And then finally, we have respond. So trauma-informed organizations respond to this knowledge about trauma by actively engaging students in ways that promote healing and avoid re-traumatization. So this also means we focus on our own needs, our own well-being, tend to our own needs for self-care. And when we focus on practices that are good for all students, it makes it easier for us to explore the application of these trauma-informed principles and ways to balance those literacy goals that are so important, obviously, to the Reading Partners program with relationships and well-being in our daily practices and interactions with students. So those are kind of the three characteristics of trauma-informed practice. And we're going to kind of jump in to that first little bubble, which is realizing the prevalence and impact of trauma. And we're actually going to walk through some statistics and some data to kind of get at this realizing aspect of trauma-informed practices. So first, we're going to look at some COVID data. You can see on this slide that if we're thinking about the experiences of our Black and Brown students at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic last year, an individual trauma may be the serious illness of a family member, but that trauma is also happening in the context of the collective Black experience. So you can see this statistic here that 74% of deaths in the DC area occurred in the Black community. And that is driven, by discriminatory systemic, economic, and healthcare practices that increase the likelihood that this community would be infected with the virus, have limited access to care, and worse outcomes. Even before COVID, about half of DC youth had experienced at least one trauma, and 1/3 of Black children in the District of Columbia experienced 2 or more traumatic experiences, which is 6 times the rate among white children. Here's some more data just about some trauma that exists on the collective and systemic level. This is some data from last summer, but you can see here 338 students were arrested across DC schools. 60% of girls arrested in DC schools were under the age of 15, and 19 shootings took place within a block of a DC public school. Trauma or chronic trauma exposure can negatively impact a person's ability to learn. So there have been studies that demonstrate the impact of what we call adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. That just refers to a traumatic event. So there's been studies that demonstrate the impact of those ACEs on academic concerns. So this chart you see on this slide is from data from a study done in Spokane, Washington, with about 2,100 elementary school students. And as you can see, the more ACEs that a student has experienced, the more likely they are to have academic problems. So data from this study showed that ACEs were actually the second strongest predictor of academic failure, behind special education placement. And, we share all of this data and all of these statistics with you, again, not so that we make assumptions about our students, but that just so that we're aware that there are things that could be affecting students we work with. And now, before we jump into talking about practices that you can use when you're working with students, we want to really flesh out that definition of trauma, those shared definitions. So when we describe something as trauma, what do we mean? This definition has kind of 3 components that you can see in the bubbles here. So the first, trauma is the harmful interruption of safety, agency, dignity, or belonging. Trauma can be acute. That's something that is incidental, probably easily recognizable for most of us, something like a car accident, getting bit by a dog. And some of us and kids may have really stressful experiences in the classroom or during learning. For example, being called out by a teacher or something like that happens all the time might be an experience that is very stressful for a student. Trauma can also be secondary, which is exposure to the trauma of others, by being in close contact with the traumatized individual. So that could be witnessing a trauma or being in relationship with someone going through a hard time. Trauma can also be chronic. That's something that happens over time rather than at one point. It's multiple varied events, things like neglect, domestic violence, an incident of war are all examples of chronic trauma. Trauma can also be cumulative, so it happens in a way that compounds. Those events can be interrelated or not related, but they're happening together and at the same time. And those individual events may not be traumatic in and of themselves, but the complex of various potentially traumatic events can result in a trauma or a trauma response. So like, for example, if we think about students this past year, COVID is happening, school, they're at virtual school, maybe they're missing social interaction, and all of those things independent of each other may not be traumatic, but the complex of those things together may result in a trauma or a trauma response. And then lastly, trauma can be complex, which is something that is chronic and relational. So complex trauma is both children's exposure to multiple traumatic events and the wide-ranging long-term effects of that exposure. Sometimes people talk about or think about complex trauma as like sanctuary trauma. So thinking about a person, place, or process that is supposed to be safe, but isn't. And then this last bubble here, we have trauma is something that overwhelms our ability to cope or integrate our emotional experience of an event. And the last definition on here is harm, which is a real or perceived unmet need. And those needs referring to the needs in that first bubble, the need for safety, agency, dignity, and belonging. And kind of along that note, those 4 needs that we saw in that definition that I just mentioned are also called our anchors of resilience. So resilience is an individual's ability to cope with adversity and adapt to challenges or change. And so those traumatic events disrupt our sense of these 4 anchors of resilience, our sense of safety, agency, dignity, or belonging, in such a way that overwhelms our ability to cope and make sense of the experience. Many of the beliefs that, and values that we hold dear often can be attributed to one of these 4 elements of support. So we have safety, the sense of being physically, psychologically, and emotionally secure. You can also think of this as being safe from harm, safe to explore, try new things, feeling safe enough to take a risk. And then we have agency, which is the ability to make a decision, experience reasonable consequences of that decision, and then make another decision. Dignity, a sense of place and power in the world, and then belonging, feeling connected and like a member of a group. So these are our 4 anchors of resilience. And now we're going to talk about how trauma can operate at different levels. So it's probably easiest for us to identify individual trauma. So that's something that happens to a person. But trauma can also be collective. So collective trauma is something that affects everyone in a kinship relationship or community with that individual. So think about neighborhood or social identity. An example might be school closings or community violence. Trauma can also be systemic, something that happens through policy and institutions. So for example, institutional racism or sexism, redlining, building highways through neighborhoods. Those are examples of systemic trauma. And then we can also look at historical traumatic events and how they pass down trauma intergenerationally. So some collective traumas are so impactful that they can change the reality and behaviors of descendants. So examples include things like slavery, mass deportations, the Holocaust, Native American boarding schools. Those are all examples of historical and intergenerational trauma. Okay, so resilience also exists on different levels and comes from having access to safe spaces where students can draw support from trusted adults and peers and use and practice emotional regulation skills to help them cope with challenges as they experience them. So that individual resilience can be demonstrated through personal attributes like optimism or meaning making, and the individual resilience is really great, but it needs to be supported by those collective and systemic factors that allow it to blossom and grow. So collective resilience draws on assets within communities to promote healing. Things like social connections and accessible systems to improve the entire community's physical, behavioral, and social health. And then systemic resilience refers to systems that are dynamic and responsive and include diversity and participation. So policy shifts in support for trauma-informed care is an example of working towards that systemic resilience. All right. So now that we just talked through that first kind of bubble of trauma-informed practices of realizing the prevalence and impact of trauma, grounding ourselves in those definitions, we're going to transition to talking a little more about recognizing the signs of trauma and the need for behavioral and learning supports. So we're going to do that by talking a little bit about how trauma can affect the brain. So basically in our brain, there's a lot of different parts of it, and I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm not an expert in the brain, but I do know that in what we call the thinking brain, we have our prefrontal cortex, responsible for thinking and logic, the hippocampus, which regulates memories. And then we also have a part of our brain called the amygdala, which is that kind of fear center. It stores emotional memories of events, and it's what kind of controls that fight flight response. And we call this our survival brain. So when we are in that survival brain, that mode of fight, flight, or freeze, and we also have fawn on this slide, which is a trauma response where someone maybe leans on a people pleasing in a way that to keep themselves safe. And when we're in this survival brain, our thinking brain is no longer functioning in a mode where we would be ready and able to learn. And that reactive part of our brain, the amygdala, really takes over. And students who have experienced chronic exposure to stress can often develop the habit of looking for danger around every corner, and their brain has adapted really well to help them do that. And this overabundance of stress hormones can cause damage to the structural development of the brain, and that high arousal of the stress system creates a more active amygdala or fear center, which results in reacting to immediate danger, even when there is not. So trauma can also lead students to shut off from their emotions, shut off their impulses, repress their thoughts and feelings. And without a trauma lens, which is what we're really working on building today, we might look at those student behaviors as willful disobedience, rather than viewing them as a child trying to do their best to survive and protect themselves from a perceived threat, even if we don't view the situation as threatening at all. So that's one example of how chronic trauma exposure can affect the brain. And a second biological adaptation to trauma exposure is the phenomenon of trauma reminders, which you have probably heard referred to as triggers. So as I mentioned on that last slide, the amygdala stores emotional memories of traumatic events. So for students who have experienced trauma, there may be sights or sounds or smells, interpersonal interactions that become associated with those experiences. And then those senses become powerful reminders of the trauma. And when they're encountered, trigger a biological and psychological response that is as intense as the original experience. So in that way, triggers are really like time travel. They can transport students back to the moment of the trauma, make them feel as though the trauma is happening again. So this is an instance where it may seem like a student has gone from 0 to 100 for no apparent reason. It's also important to note that you and likely your student may not be aware or won't always be aware of your student's specific triggers, but there are some common triggers to keep in mind that you can see listed on this slide. So things like yelling, tone of voice, physical contact, loud noises, a sense of shame or failure, unexpected changes or transitions, and even a special occasion or an anniversary could be a trigger for a student. So I would just keep these common triggers in mind as you're working with students. And now we're going to talk a little more about a few behaviors that could be a sign that your student needs a behavioral or emotional support. And I do want to note that these behaviors listed on this slide are not necessarily indicators that a student has experienced trauma. So again, we don't want to assume our students are dealing with the impacts of trauma, but it is important to approach these behaviors through a trauma lens. And the strategies and tools we'll get into in the second half of this session, relationship building and self-regulation, will support all students, regardless of whether these behaviors are related to trauma. But some of the behaviors, listed on this slide, they may be a sign that your student needs some kind of support in your session. So you can see them listed here: difficulty managing emotions, dissociation, trouble managing behavior or interactions with others, problems with cognition. So all the examples listed on this slide could be signs that your student needs some kind of support. All right, and I know I just said a lot of information over these past 20 slides, and it's all kind of bringing us to this guiding question, which is that the goal of this session of being trauma-informed educators is really to shift our perspective from what's wrong with that student to I wonder what that student needs. And as we begin to think about this concept, I want you to think about the lens through which we see child behavior both inside and outside of the classroom, and how that can affect our response to that behavior. So this work, the work of becoming trauma-informed, invites us really to deepen our ability to see through a trauma lens, which really allows us to shift our focus from attributing a child's challenges from, like a personal flaw or characteristic to possible external or environmental factors. So that trauma lens helps us appreciate the possibility that stress could be playing a role in the behavior, even though sometimes we're never going to know whether that's the case. And frankly, we really don't need to. What we need is the space that this trauma-informed lens provides us to appreciate context, foster compassion, and help us see strengths in the face of adversity. So again, we're coming back to this goal. The goal of being a trauma-informed educator is to ask, what does this child need and what can I do to support this child? All right, and I know that was a lot of information. It might be a little heavy, and you might be asking yourself, well, what can we do? How can we support our students? How can we facilitate that resilience in the face of chronic trauma? And what we're going to do in the next section of this training is talk about some hands-on real tools and strategies that you can use in your sessions with students to help build that resilience, and build great relationships and support students. The two strategies we're going to talk about today are supportive relationships and regulation strategies. So supportive and nurturing relationships can help modulate immediate responses and recalibrate systems. And emotional regulation, which is the ability to manage and cope with emotions and the types of challenges that trauma presents. When students have those skills, it's less likely they will become overwhelmed by trauma, and more likely that if they do, they'll be able to restore a sense of balance more quickly. India is going to take us through this next section, really talking about these tools and strategies we can use in real sessions with our students to support that resilience.
So now we're going to talk through some tools and strategies you can use when working with students to help foster and build greater relationships, which is one of the powerful ways to support resilience in our students. The developmental relationship are close connections through which young people discover who they are, cultivate their abilities to shape their own lives, and learn how to engage with and contribute to the world around them. It is a powerful and positively effective in shaping the young person's identity. It helps the young person develop a thriving mindset. While many individuals may never participate in a literacy organization as a child, most people are able to identify an informal mentor they had as a child. Most people speak of different reasons that are summed up by the elements and actions of a developmental relationship that are defined by the Search Institute, a nonprofit that has done a lot of research on developmental relationships and youth development, a nonprofit think tank dedicated to research for positive youth development. The developmental framework is comprised as 5 elements, expressed in 20 specific actions that make a relationship meaningful in a young person's life. I now play the video. Okay.
Pretty much everybody who works with kids or interacts with them knows that relationships matter incredibly for how they develop, they perform in school, where they end up in the future. But that doesn't mean you know how to build a great relationship with a young person who you work with or that you just care about. At Search Institute, we are 4 years into a major project of research to try and open that black box of transformative relationships in kids' lives and really figure out what happens in relationships that help kids be and become their best selves. What we've discovered is that there are 5 critical elements of a developmental relationship. The first of those elements is kind of obvious. It's expressing care. And the key idea there is letting kids know that they matter to you.
Be dependable. Listen. Believe in me. Be warm. Encourage.
The second element of a developmental relationship is challenging growth. And that means pushing kids to continually get better, no matter how well they're already doing.
Expect my best. Stretch. Perfecto feeling. Hold me accountable.
The third element is providing support, and that means helping kids complete tasks and achieve their goals.
Navigate. Empower. Advocate. Set boundaries.
The fourth element is sharing power, and that's about treating kids with respect and giving them a say.
Respect me.
Include me.
Collaborate. Let me lead.
And the fifth element is expanding possibilities, which means connecting kids with people and places that broaden their worlds.
Broaden horizons. Inspire. Connect.
We know from our studies that when kids experience relationships that are characterized by these 5 elements, they're much more likely to possess key social emotional skills like motivation and a sense of belonging, empathy, and much less likely to engage in risk behaviors. Whether you're working with kids in your job or raising them at home or just interacting with them in your community, we know that if you express care, challenge growth, provide support, share power, and expand possibility, you'll be doing tremendous things to help those kids be and become their best selves.
These 5 elements of the developmental relationship foster an intuitive understanding of what it could mean to approach our relationship with children with greater intentionality. This tool is also easy to share with other adults that work with children so they can easily add it to their tool bag. Let's take a look. At first glance, this concept may seem deceptively basic, but I urge you to reflect more deeply on each element, using them to evaluate daily interactions with youth in your life. Some people often ask, where do I start? It is important to start with yourself and be aware and honest about your own needs first. We have to be able to model healthy and personal skills and behaviors for our students. Ask yourself, what do you need to be safe and support a student in building their practices? The research is clear. We know it all begins with relationships. And when we think about the framework for building developmental relationships, that we just talked about, let's look at how we can use relationships to regulate and respond to young person's needs. Here are some comments from students when they feel a caring connection with an adult. So when they feel connection, they usually feel that when the adult knows their name and how to spell it, they recognize their mood, they can disagree, but without making them feel put down. They feel comfortable over asking questions or saying how they feel. And signs when a need is not being met are dramatic mood swings, control seeking, demands for routine, fear of abandonment, fear of authority, using personal words like love or hate to describe you or the situation. Now we're going to talk about another method and some skills to help build regulations in our students. Building trust and connections by setting up a low stress environment. So a great way to set up a low stress environment is creating a learning space. This may be in the classroom, in the reading centers where you sit at a specific desk, you have specific materials out in the open, but even in the virtual space, be it if they're at home or in the classroom, it might just be sitting in a special location, having something there with them to create that learning space that you can tell them, let's go to our learning space to conduct our lessons. Using an agenda. We have an agenda in our curriculum that you can use and stick to help you with that. Being on time or in communication. So if you are running late, please make sure you let your program coordinator know that you're running late and be communicating with them when you're close or almost there. Creating a routine. You can also use this with your agenda, but also if you get to know your student, you can start making a routine of stopping before the student will be allowed to take a break, or asking them a few questions at the beginning of the lesson, which comes into question or challenge of the week. We can ask your student and at the end of every lesson, how do you think they did? Or have a challenge of the week of being mindful Monday or wacky Wednesday, where they say something wacky that day, or talk to me Tuesday, we guys just talk. Show and tell is easier to do in the virtual space where you at home and they are either at home themselves or in the classroom. But you can show off something that you have and they can show off something that they have. And two truths and a lie is where you tell your students 3 facts, 3 things. 2 of those things are truth and 1 of them is a lie. And they have to guess which one is the truth and which one is the lie. So practice developing a support plan. On this side, you'll see a bunch of questions that you could ask your student. A great time to ask some of them is during the lesson 0, the first time you meet your student. So these questions can help you get to know your student even better and help you understand them as a learner. They can also help you know when your student may need a learning support and how to support them best in the challenging moments. And if your student doesn't have the language, it can help you get to know them better. So let's look at some of these questions. My favorite question to always in my lesson is, what are you good at? I usually cater it to what are 2 things you did well during the lesson so they can look back on their accomplishments. But also a great one is, if you could change 1 thing about your experience, I usually put school, what would it be? And usually I get the response, longer recess, which I can also do. So another strategy to build self-regulation skills is about teaching and modeling self-regulation skills like problem solving. So here's some in-the-moment strategies that we can go over. Check-in, equip check-ins. Here's some in-the-moment strategies we can go over. Checking in with your student, you can use some of these. Highs and lows is where you ask your student a high of the week and a low of the week. Rose, thorn, and bud follows that same format, where rose is a high, thorn is a challenge, and bud is something they're looking forward to. So that might be the weekend, thorn might be that it's only Monday, and a rose might be that at least tomorrow is Tuesday. And weather report is when your student you ask your student how they're doing, and they give you their response in a weather report. So if they're feeling upset, they might say it's rainy, or if they're feeling happy, they might say it's sunny. Also promote and reinforce optimal thinking, so positive self-talk. What are 3 things you do really well? What are 2 things you love about yourself? Those are great ways to promote positive self-talk. Here are some in-the-moment strategies that can help self-regulation skills in your student. So if you are in a lesson with your student and something happens, you can use this method. It's called the STOP method. Stop what you're doing, take a breath, observe your thoughts, and proceed with something that will help you in the moment. You can use this visual you see on the slide and talk with your student. Have them identify their feelings using the chart. Things like it's okay to feel angry, we can't hurt ourselves, we can draw a picture of how we're feeling, or do some jumping jacks, something in that regard. Here's some other strategies for refocusing. Counting breaths. When you breathe in, you count. Breathing with a shape, as you can see the star here. You breathe in, you hold, breathe out. You can also do this with square, which might be easier for some students. Mindful observations like body scanning, where you scan your body at one point at a time. Mindful movement is progressive muscle relaxation, where you at one at a time ease your shoulders and your arms and your hands. You go down your whole body. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, shake it off. Goes 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Then at the end of 1, you can make a big boom or just jump up real high. Animal impersonations is my favorite, where you can pretend to be a turtle and pull your arms in, or your legs and your heads into your shell, or you can be a giraffe and you can stretch really wide, make your neck really long.